All right, let's dive into the Book of Abraham. It's a scripture from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that has been right at the heart of a debate for, nearly 200 years now. So in this explainer, we're going to unpack the central arguments, pulling directly from the source material that really frames this whole controversy.
So it all boils down to one big question, right? Is the Book of Abraham divinely inspired scripture, or is it a 19th century creation? We're going to look at both sides of that, exploring the historical evidence, the book's pretty unique theology, and then, finally, the role that personal faith plays in all of it.
Let's start right where the debate begins, with the physical evidence. We're talking about the ancient Egyptian papyri that the church's founder, Joseph Smith, said he translated. This is really ground zero for the entire controversy.
Okay, so this slide gets to the heart of the disagreement. On one hand, you have proponents who, according to the source, aren't necessarily arguing for a literal word-for-word translation. They suggest the papyri might have been more of a catalyst, like a spiritual jumping-off point that opened the door for Joseph Smith to receive truth from God. But then critics point to what feels like a huge problem. The pieces of the papyri we still have today, modern Egyptologists have identified them as pretty common funerary texts, stuff that seems to have absolutely nothing to do with Abraham. And that, right there, is the fundamental conflict.
So let's put the physical papyri on the shelf for a minute and look at the actual content of the book, because the ideas inside the text, they add a whole other layer to this debate.
And these themes are so important because you have to understand they were completely radical ideas from mainstream Christianity back in the 1830s. Things like us living before we were born or God having a physical body. That just wasn't part of the conversation back then. So the question becomes, were these truths that were newly revealed, or were they ideas that were newly invented?
This timeline gives us some really critical context. Think about it. Joseph Smith was only 27 years old when he got these papyri, and the translation happened during this period of incredibly intense theological development for him and for the early church. A lot of those unique doctrines we just looked at were being introduced and figured out right at this time.
So to really get a handle on why these theological claims are so significant, the source material asks us to think about two very different ways of looking at Christianity: Reformation versus Restoration.
Think of it this way. The Protestant Reformation, as it's framed here, was about fixing a system that had become corrupted. The goal was to go back to the Bible and correct the errors. The Restoration, though, makes a much more radical claim. It says that the original truth and, this is key, the divine authority to act in God's name were completely lost from the earth after the original apostles died. So the goal wasn't to fix the old system, it was to bring back a brand new one, directly from heaven through a living prophet.
So if you're looking at it from this restoration point of view, the conflict with mainstream Christianity isn't a bug, it's a feature. The argument presented here is that if you are genuinely restoring truths that have been lost for centuries, you should expect them to clash with the established traditions of the day, kind of like how Christ's own teachings challenged the religious leaders of his time. And this whole idea of ongoing revelation is just central to the entire framework. This quote here, one of the church's articles of faith, is highlighted in the source to really explain the mindset. New scriptures, like the Book of Abraham, aren't seen as contradicting the Bible, but as adding to it. It's seen as a continuous, unfolding conversation with God.
And all of this, as our source frames it, brings the whole debate right down to a fundamental question about Joseph Smith himself. Was he a conduit for divine knowledge, or was he something else entirely?
Our source's author really frames the issue with this sharp choice. The argument is, look, given the sheer volume of unique and internally consistent teachings Joseph Smith produced, the idea that he was just, guessing, that becomes a pretty extraordinary claim all by itself.
And the author of the source material makes their own conclusion crystal clear. When asked to rate Joseph Smith on a scale from 0 to 20, they give him a perfect 20. For them, the evidence points overwhelmingly to him being a prophet. And this brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, according to the source: personal belief.
But then, after laying out all the historical and theological arguments, the source makes this really interesting pivot. It argues that the most powerful form of evidence isn't intellectual at all. It's something that happens on a deeply personal level. This slide really shows that pivot from the head to the heart. The source makes a clear distinction between intellectual conviction, which, can lead to a strong belief but is always open to debate and new information, and what's called a spiritual witness. This witness is described as a direct, personal confirmation from God that gives believers what they call sure knowledge, a conviction that isn't really based on logic and can't just be argued away.
So how does that happen? To explain the process, the source points to this analogy from the Book of Mormon, where faith is compared to a seed. It's not a one-time thing. It's a living thing that starts with just a desire to believe, and then you have to actively nourish it with study and action. And if you do, it grows into what's described as perfect knowledge.
And, as the source really emphasizes, that nourishment comes through action. Citing the New Testament, it makes the point that service and actually living the principles being taught are the real, tangible ways you show your belief, and that's what strengthens and keeps that personal witness alive over time.
So ultimately, the journey to understand the Book of Abraham, as our source shows it, it moves from the library to the heart. It goes from analyzing papyri and debating history to a question of personal conviction. And it leaves us with this final thought to consider. When all the evidence and all our intellect can only take us so far, what role does faith play in finding truth?